Hi, welcome to TGCon Live and our session on predictive AI and incident management. We will begin momentarily. First, I have just a few housekeeping announcements. I want to remind everybody that theater mode is going to give you your best viewing experience. So click on that box. It gives you the opportunity to see the slides, to also see a thumbnail image of your speaker. And you can also see the chat box to stay engaged with the TraceGains community. You can also use the chat box to type any questions that you might have during the session. We'll get to just as many audience questions as we can during the Q&A portion at the end. Also next to the chat box is a poll tab. You can click in there and answer our polls that are relevant to this topic. I also want to let you know if you happen to have any audio or video problems, you can exit out of theater mode and then click on the support tab in the upper right-hand corner of the main screen. Click support and then click get help, and those folks can triage your problem for you. And finally, I want to invite you, when we're finished with the session today, please follow the link to the post-session survey. Your feedback really matters to us, and I hope you take the time to do that. Again, our topic is predictive AI and incident management. My name is Dana Johnson Downing, and I'm the Director of Policy and Partnerships here at TraceGains, and I'll be the roundtable moderator. I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to talk to and to introduce our panelists. First, we have Dr. Amy Kircher. She's a doctor of public health. She's the senior advisor of the Food Protection and Defense Institute at the University of Minnesota. We also have Greg Heartman. He's our VP of Product Management here at TraceGains. Another TraceGains colleague is Nate York. He's a data specialist. All three of these people have big brains, and you're going to listen to a really interesting discussion. They also are able to take this really, data is kind of scary topic and make it interesting. You'll see what I mean here in a moment. Before we dive in, I'm going to just do a little level setting, because the words artificial intelligence and predictive analytics and incident management, they seem like really heady topics, right? So we're going to narrow it down a little bit. Obviously, we're talking about these through the lens of the food and agriculture industry to start with. And then to narrow it down even a little bit more, here are some of the things we're going to touch on. If we could all predict the future, wouldn't that be great? Well, the good news is technology and human intelligence can be combined to analyze data and market signals to help us better prepare for future market conditions and risk. We're also going to look at things like weather and other disasters and how they can spark a series of cascading events that can cause crop failure, spoilage, raw material shortages, price spikes, and other issues. We're also going to talk about how do you balance speed versus accuracy. You might want to take some information that you get off of Twitter, gives you a quick competitive advantage. But then, how do you balance that need for speed versus certainty and wanting to really know that you're right? Maybe something that you could find in a peer-reviewed study. We're also going to talk about the fact that what we're talking about really isn't space age, Jetson era stuff. Predictive tools exist today, and they're getting better and more automated all the time. University of Minnesota and TraceGains both work in this area, and we'll be talking about some specific tools. Our first panelist I'm going to have speak is Dr. Amy Kircher. All of these folks have really long resumes and some very interesting background experience, and I'm going to have them highlight that for you and give us their point of view. Amy, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dana, and thanks to TraceGains for the invitation. My name is Amy Kircher. I currently direct a collaborative called the Strategic Partnerships and Research Collaborative, looking at big complex research projects, but also serve as the senior advisor and was the former director of the Food Protection and Defense Institute. Now, that institute was created after 9/11 to look at disruptions in the food system, initially from terrorism. So how might bad guys ruin your lunch? But really that morphed into how do disruptions globally ripple and through cascading effects impact what's available in the grocery store and how safe our food is. So we really look from end to end, and we say farm to fork or boat to throat all the way from the front to the back for any supply chain, and how we find both risk and vulnerability in those supply chains such that we could mitigate it. My background is epidemiology, so I've spent a fair amount of time looking at infectious diseases, but in the same supply chain vein, how do we get resources in disasters to locations that need it at the right time, in the right amount? And that's been important work. And AI, predictive analytics, incident management is all wrapped up into that. So using the supply chain and using data we have available, even non-traditional data that we wouldn't consider for supply chains, super important as we fuse it together. And what I like to say, we do sense making. We make sense of that data such that we can help companies make better decisions. So thrilled to be here. Thanks again for the invitation.
So, I'm ready to go. So, hello, I'm Greg Heartman. I'm the Vice President of Product Management at Trace Gains. I've been in product for, in technology products for over 20 years. Started my career at Microsoft and then moved to a series of startups and mid-sized companies. My first experience with machine learning and AI models was back with an educational technology company that we did remediation learning for early readers. And we use technology in those learning models to understand how to adjust curriculum accordingly to how that particular reader was doing. And since then, I've moved on to other companies that look at other ways of using data to look at predictive behaviors. Most recently, one of the companies that we worked with, it was Health Notes, and we worked in the natural products industry and used machine learning capabilities to build extensive data taxonomies where we could deliver targeted content and extract targeted information about dietary supplements and health effects and things like that. And so we've brought that same technology and that same knowledge here to Trace Gains, and we're expanding it out into the food world too.
Yeah, hi, I'm Nate York. It's nice to be here talking with you today. I work in data in the R&D department. We have a small team that has been working on content for a long time. We actually came to Trace Gains through Health Notes together. I've been working with Greg for a long time in products, new products. And we had been putting together a dietary supplement taxonomy with regulations and rules and synonyms and all sorts of identification codes and threading that throughout the digital realm. And then we applied the same thing to food. So now we've taken this and we've been working, now that we are Trace Gainsers, we are applying this to the food world, and we've been just the same thing we've been doing for a long time, but now we're doing it in a world that is very hungry for it as well, the food industry. I've worked for Trace Gains for 2 years now. I was with Health Notes for 6. I've been in the industry, technology for my entire professional career, including, not limited to, I was the network administrator for Mountain Rose Herbs for 5 years. That's part of the, I was in the industry before I was even in the industry, actually, it turns out. It's kind of cool. Super excited. I love data. I love solving problems with data. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about today.
Thanks, Nate. I'm going to invite our panelists to talk on, we're going to cover some of these areas about examples of incidents, some cascading effects. We're going to talk about what that means and give some good examples. We're going to eventually get to some post-pandemic learnings. And then we're going to talk to you in a little bit about why machines can't do it all, why human intelligence is really an important part of this recipe. So first, I'm going to ask Amy to start us off with some recognizable predictive analytics examples that you've worked with in your career, and then maybe some of the other panelists would like to chime in.
Sure. I think, at least in the food space, when we think of predictive analytics and we think about what could disrupt a food system, the first thing that comes to my mind is, and I grew up a farmer's daughter, is weather, right? The good old, how do we digitize? I would always say to my dad, what he would say, what are you doing? And I said, I'm trying to digitize the farmer's almanac, right? What will be the weather patterns? What are the soil conditions? When might a farmer put a seed bean in the ground such that I know when they're going to harvest and if that harvest is going to be plentiful or it's going to be short? And so I would say pulling that sort of those atypical data streams together really helps us understand, for instance, yields of maize or yields of sorghum or soybeans. So just knowing the average, what the temperature is today all over the world, what season we're in, and when a seed might go on the ground, and then monitoring weather patterns such that we know if we are in flood situations or drought situations, we can look historically at the weather and what the yields were for each season to anticipate what kind of outcome we'll have during harvest season. So to me, that is a great example of predictive analytics, because for a company that might mean they typically buy 12 months on contract perhaps. So if I've already put my contract down before seed's in the ground and I know I'm gonna have low yield, I'm going to start wanting to look to buy on the spot market. So it gives you an advantage to really understanding where you might have a deficit on contract and where you might need to supplement from the spot market, thereby getting to things available in the supply chain earlier. So I think that's a great example of using predictive AI. I think other examples include looking at where product is grown or where we source it from. That might be true of spices. So if we know that there are disruptions in the Middle East, we may not see spices come out of that country as regularly as they typically do if we know that there has been movement restrictions, or if there's additional layers of security, or that country isn't allowing export. That's good predictors of how the market may shift in later months.
How about you, Greg?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in with some general, for those that don't typically, have predictive analytics or AI in their lives on a day-to-day basis, a couple of really general examples where it's used extensively would be weather forecasting and healthcare, right? Weather forecasting, the example here is in the last 40 years, we can now predict reliably a 5-day forecast where 40 years ago, we had the same predictability for a 1 day. And that's not because humans have gotten smarter. It's because we're now collecting hundreds of thousands of additional data points from satellites and other data collection capabilities around the world. And we can apply machines to crunch that data and look at and surface patterns and trends that we wouldn't necessarily be able to do as humans ourselves. Healthcare is another big one, and they're using this in all sorts of different ways, anywhere from being able to train machines to look at images around skin cancer identification, subtleties in different types of predictive cancer identification, to drug therapies, right? One of the notoriously difficult and complex components of drug therapies is drug interactions with one another and counterindications based on certain populations and health risks. Again, so many data points and so many complex relationships that it's very, very difficult for humans to be able to go through all that data, but you can apply machine learning models to pull out areas that scientists wouldn't be able to realize themselves without using machines to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, also, Dana, legal contracts and real estate. That's another place where AI is making a big difference. Machine learning, complex contracts, complex situations. There are lots of paperwork, only looking for a few actually key parts that are the important meat of the documents. It's another place where AI is really changing the industry fast.
Yeah, so I guess the point there is, machine learning and AI is already affecting major industries. In the food industry, given a lot of the complexities of not only the supply chain, but even some of the growing, the changes in our environment and, some of the changes globally, geopolitically that can that can affect our supply chain, you know, we could, the food chain is right to apply these types of technologies.
Okay, on to our next question. What are some examples of market signals that could turn into incidents that have cascading effects? And Amy, I'm going to have you start us off again because you really specialize in this area.
Sure. So things that you want to watch, I would say, you know, every industry works slightly differently in each commodity type, whether it's drugs or if it is food or even maybe car parts. So really understanding sort of your commodity type in the market, but also from a market signal standpoint, being able to understand where those shifts exist. So one is a price shift. So when a price increases, obviously demand changes perhaps, or when we have surplus or deficit. So those are sort of tried and true, we know those already. But other things, when we look at market signals, really watching, and this is especially true of drugs, which I follow, and I'm guessing dietary supplements, is when there's company acquisitions. So when does one company acquire another company, and what shifts might we see? So do we get down to perhaps with one active pharmaceutical ingredient where there's now only 3 companies that synthesize that particular product, right? That is going to shift the market. That could have cascading effects that will create an incident, especially if one of those particular companies has an error or has counterfeit product. All of a sudden we're left without replacement products. So certainly those shifts make a big difference in those cascading effects. And so I would look at, look at the traditional shifts, but also look at how the environment or the context around those products, do they have to travel a long way? So transportation shifts may affect it. If gas prices increase, do we see less raw materials or inputs at a company that are available? Does it cost more? So those are all shifts that we should follow and track, because those might change the market and how the market is behaving.
And you shared the story with us about cashews and global pandemics. Read us into this story.
Yeah, thanks for letting me share the story. I thought it was fascinating. We're doing some work right now with the FAO to look at food disruptions given COVID and how those food disruptions affect Africa specifically. And even when we think, those of us that look at this all the time, we think we're understanding the market, something catches us off guard, which is true of this case. So in Africa, 2 million farmers produce about 56% of the world's cashews. And now that number changes each year, so don't hold fast to 56%, but go up or down a step. India is the largest global importer of cashews at about 1.7 billion annually. Well, because of COVID, we have movement restrictions. And so what we follow right away, this was true of Ebola and cocoa too, what we follow right away are what are those things that no longer function or work or are the norm or were canceled because of a movement restriction. So one of those is Indian weddings, of course, like weddings around the world were postponed. One of the primary desserts or treats at an Indian wedding is a cashew fudge product. Well, because all those weddings were postponed, there was no longer a demand for cashews in India. So we anticipated, because of COVID, that we would see surplus of cashews in Africa because there was no export to India. What I hadn't really looked at and countered until we got additional data is that US consumers were panic buying, and we all saw that, right? Toilet paper, yeast. I'm not sure if we all have, newly formed bread bakers in the country, but, shelves empty. Well, cashews were one of those items that was panic bought. So where we expected to see sort of this big shift in the market where we'd have more supply available in Africa, we haven't really seen that. Even though the weddings were postponed, that was countered by the panic buying in various places throughout the world. So that's just an example of how you have to understand the context of what's happening around the world or within your commodity type to really understand those shifts and get ahead of them.
Okay. You also shared a story, a COVID story about locusts with us. Let our audience know the details here.
Sure. And this is a little bit the day that the locust infestations were starting to be published. I just thought, could we have one more biblical disaster, frogs maybe next? But in 2020, right after COVID, a locust infestation started in East Africa, the worst in 70 years. And because of COVID, and again, following movement restrictions, technical experts were not allowed to enter. We couldn't get them into the area to deal with the infestation. Additionally, we could not get product into those areas as well. So now we are having an uncontrolled locust infestation. And then let me move to cascading effects. So, right, locusts are a problem for lots of reasons, but for staple crops, certainly they devastate a field. Additionally, they take away pasture land. So for the pastoralists who are moving their livestock around during the lean season, not rainy season, the lean season, where they're trying to feed their cattle or any other livestock, those pastures are now ruined. So we'll see less available meat available on the market. And then of course there's some asset damages as well. So now go forward and look to the cascading effect. Less product in the market increases the food insecurity in East Africa, where we already have seemingly insurmountable problems. So because of COVID, we're having increased food insecurity. And now because of locusts and our inability to counter that or mitigate that because of the restrictions put in place because of COVID, we're seeing additional insecurity happening. Now, this is not it happens on Monday and we see problems on Friday. It happens in March, and for the next 2 years, that part of the world will be impacted.
What are some examples of data and data sources that can be used to gain insights? Nate, do you want to start us off on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. We have taken a look at data sources from all over the world and have been looking at how to tap into these resources and look deeper into them. Some of them would be things like the FDA with alerts, market withdrawals, some RASIF, the rapid alert system they use in the EU, as well as voluntary type recalls and things that are happening in the press. We also, follow very closely different sorts of the herbal groups like APA, things like this. We're keeping our ear to the ground all of the time, looking for those types of new things coming on the market. Things getting taxonomies, genuses getting crammed together or teased apart because they're actually separate things. These are some of the places that you would go to get that kind of data. As far as you're looking at from a jurisdictional point of view.
And to add there a little bit, and Amy, I know you've shared with me a couple of other interesting stories about, and I'm spacing on the term, but how much you trust the data that's coming in, and what level of trust that you put into it as more and more comes in. So you might get some initial low trust signals that can send up, antenna, and then you can start to gather other data sources and to kind of build up evidence for the cases it might be.
And I think we refer to those as micro alerts. So it's not enough. It's not enough of an alert to trigger, call out the army. We've got to counter this and spend $10 billion to fix it. It's really, what are those low-level signals that when we combine them, give us an earlier indication that we can that there's a problem happening, or that the conditions are right for a problem to happen, or that we can follow and track and be quicker to mitigate. And so I think those micro alerts are important, but sometimes those micro alerts come from Twitter, they come from news reports that aren't always reliable. So, one thing we always need to do is really put a level of trust on those, and then how will we use those to make decisions? Certainly the WHO is very trustworthy and has great data, but they're 2 months late, perhaps. Right. So how do we balance between early signals and validity of that data, and then those late signals that are maybe more in the confirmatory, but once we see them, it's too hard to take an action?
Yeah, what's interesting to me about that and about the two examples that you walked us through with the pandemic is um, this isn't just about machines, right? You have to apply human learning to all of this and human analysis, right? So those micro triggers, may trigger some analysis for a human to say, hey, do we need to look deeper at this? Do we need to put some attention to this? Or like your two examples, hey, we think it's going to go this way, but wow, look, here's some other data sources that says it's not, it's actually going this other way. So just want to emphasize, that just because we're bringing in all this data and tying it together, it does take humans to come in and really make sense and put some analysis around it. What do you want to get out of these signals? And where do you want them to take you? It definitely needs that human analysis and touch on it too.
I think the other thing I would add that I think is important is really understanding a supply chain, certainly an end-to-end. And I think sometimes that seems really hard, but then what are those complementary things additionally that you need to source your product all the way down to sales or to whoever your customer is, whether you're in the middle of the supply chain, the end. But in the locust example, understanding, where do you get pesticides? What does that supply chain look like? Are we short of that? And then when we think about oil and gas, how is that going to affect me moving product or someone moving product to me? So, there's a lot to do. And I think that's a combination of machines and humans, but knowing what are those peripherals that you need to really understand if you're going to mitigate adverse consequences. And so, humans have to think through that a little bit, and then using machines, we can perhaps do some of that bridging where a human can't process all the data that would be available and model it.
All right, this is another one for you, Nate. Explain technology's role in structuring data and tool sets so we can apply predictive models to data.
Yeah, fantastic. So, we've been working for a long time on dietary supplement and food ingredient taxonomy. And that includes, and finished goods as well, actually. And that includes vacuuming in every bit of information that we could find about it from every source. So from all over the place, FDA, from FoodX, APA, the DSLD, which is the Dietary Supplement Label Database, WADA, all sorts, everywhere that we could find lists of ingredients and status and synonyms and misspellings, and then classify these and building tools to actually organize those and then also tap into them to be able to do things like take a dietary supplement label and break it down into the individual ingredients and then tie those ingredients across to their déchet status and et cetera, be able to break that down to our taxonomy so that looking at it through that lens, we have some explanation of what these ingredients are. And then when we come across a new spelling, we capture that. When we come across an alternate term that's industry specific, we capture that, or a CAS number, or, and so that, and then we take those and we apply those to our structure. We adjust our structure when necessary. Then we also use that as kind of the base structure to then tie this confidence level into that we have of what is this thing? What is it called across the industry? What are the multiples? What are the multiple other things that it could be called, and what are its duplicates? We've been able to do this to a high degree of accuracy in dietary supplements, and now we're doing it in food as well. And these tools are what we use to classify the data that we're vacuuming in, because it's way too much for somebody to do just by hand. It's and these tools pretty soon are actually going to be available within the product as well to help us make these connections between your items, between your suppliers, your items supplied. It's the confidence in the data. Of course, data is only as good as the people putting it in, right? And that's where the nuance, human nuance, Greg, you were getting at there, and Amy as well. Like, we have to see this data and see what really is it. Where does it really belong, and what does this real story? That's kind of, then that's why we really are pushing for these tools to be able to tie these to tie your items in the proper spot in the taxonomy. So we have high confidence then in the regulations that you're seeing, high confidence in the alerts that you're seeing, high confidence in the insights that we're gleaning from machine learning. It's good stuff. It's really good stuff.
So let me give an example of something like Nate's talking about and why this is important to us. You know, you can't find signals for something that is unorganized, right? So you got to say, if, you know, for instance, if you go out to Market Hub today and you just type in the keyword garlic, you're going to get probably, I'm just guessing, but probably 20,000, well, maybe not that many, thousands of results back, right? And those results that our customers have put into Market Hub are going to be everything from just the term garlic as this item, or it may be garlic bolt, or it may be garlic puree, or it may be extracted garlic, you know, dehydration, blah, 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 right? So it could be, you could have garlic represented in Market Hub, you know, dozens upon dozens of different ways. So when we're trying to find information about the supply chain of garlic, you know, how do we tie all that together? And then how do you make sense of, you know, this type of garlic versus that type of garlic? So with that, you know, as Nate was mentioning there, and I know that Dr. Kircher has spent quite a bit of time with this too, is you put together an ontology, right? That says, here's the organization of the data that we have. So what you can do when you have that organization is you can hang other data types on and data sources on that taxonomy so you can gain future insights. So one, for instance, would be weather, right? Applying weather to garlic, what does that mean? And then you can put in, you know, geopolitical. Thai garlic is produced in this region. Is there any strife? And so structured data is really key to actually driving the insights. I don't know, Dr. Kircher, if you have anything else you want to add there.
Yeah, just to reinforce the criticality of this very not sexy work to clean and organize your data up front will pay huge dividends in the end. And without it, you'll get false positives. You will miss signals. The various ways we call a garbanzo bean, or a green bean feel like you said, thousands of records. So really trying to understand that in a way, because we have a global market for food, dietary supplements, for animal feed. You know, I think we also need to recognize that the ingredients for animal feed are similar ingredients for medicines and for food, for human food. And so if we don't understand our data and be able to organize it in a way that makes sense, there's no way we'll derive insight from it.
All right. How do we balance the efficiencies of a global food supply chain with the potential bottlenecks that it can cause? And then should we domesticize raw material production to avoid the risk and some of the shortages that we've seen since the pandemic hit? I'm going to let you start us off, Amy.
I think these are great questions. And I would start the first one about the balance with efficiencies. We've created an incredible just-in-time global food supply chain where, you know, products that we have in the grocery store today, we would have never imagined having had them maybe even 20 years ago. And so that efficiency is what we are accustomed to. And then when we don't have it, you know, we as consumers are appalled and frustrated and wonder what's going on in the world. Any of the things we've talked about today, the risks and the vulnerabilities that exist in the world can derail a supply chain at any time. So how do we balance, you know, getting food from source to consumer with all the steps it needs to take? And then how do we navigate these disruptions? And to me, it really is, and I'll speak specifically to food, and I'll let the other gentleman talk about dietary supplements. We have to get from a reactive posture to a proactive or preventive posture, and we're not there yet. Truly, when we think about food safety, we wait till a cluster of people get sick. And that is not good for an ROI. That's not good for our brands, when really we need to be more proactive. And that, I think, is a culture adjustment for our industry in food and beverage. I think it also is going to require different hires in companies to help with analytics and big data and be able to make sense of that, where humans work with the machine learning and AI such that we can navigate and understand, hey, we might have a problem in South Asia. Let's monitor it for a while, and we do nothing, we do something, or we watch it. And that may save us brand damage, that may save us you know, an inability to be able to produce the foods that are in our portfolio. So I think that's really important that we flip, that it's really this flip from reactive to proactive. And that's going to take some work, and it's going to take some different hires. Regarding the domesticizing of raw material production or ingredients, I would say every company needs to really look at an end-to-end supply chain, and COVID's a great time because we've seen disruptions, and say, what is the most critical rate limiting step or ingredient in my process? And do I have a diversified sourcing portfolio from which I can buy? And by diversified, I don't mean I buy from 6 companies. Are those 6 companies then buying from one sourcer? Understand really how that supply chain flows and who's in the market. And then I think this is true of, I'll switch to drugs. We are going to have to put some of that sourcing, we're going to have to put some of that creation back into the US. If we don't, we will be left, at least with medicines and work that we've done in ER drugs, we will be left with people entering the ER that will not survive because the medicine they need to be treated isn't available in the ER because it was sourced in India or China, and we no longer have availability to it. So understand rate limiting step or ingredient or source within your supply chains for you to make your product, and then say, is it worth us constructing that source or partnering to construct that source domestically, such that in 10 years, we know that we have a consistent and reliable source for product?
Well, let me ask a follow-up question of our panel then. If we know that 80% of the world's supply of vitamin C comes from China, is it just that it hasn't been profitable to produce it domestically? What's been the driver there?
So for vitamin C, and I believe it was penicillin, but we might want to fact check me on that one. The Chinese government built a cartel and undercut all the pricing, and there was a lawsuit between the US and China, and the US lost. It is legal to build a cartel in China. And so we lost all that market to the Chinese several years ago, and so it's no longer available to us. It'll require investment.
Thanks, Amy. Let's move on to our next question about tool sets. So let's talk about, can tools help reinforce good behavior instead of just detecting bad behavior? Who wants to take that one on first? Greg?
I'll jump in there. You know, the thought here is if companies are being proactive, and Dr. Kircher talked about this a little bit earlier, if companies really focus resources, or at least a resource in the company, to be proactive, you know, it naturally starts to promote good behaviors within that company, right? So instead of just reacting to when a problem happens, you're actually proactively going out and trying to find alternatives, right? Find alternatives and mitigate your risks ahead of time, which can not only promote good behaviors within the company, but good behaviors within the supply chain, because you can shift from buying from, you know, a high risk player or a player who's not acting as well as they could to someone who is, right? Which, you know, rising tide raises all boats is the idea there. So being able to focus on looking ahead as opposed to just running from behind, I think can naturally promote good behaviors.
I'll add one additional example here, and I think it is one that comes from more geared to maybe food safety or supplement safety, is really understanding where there are potentials for disruption and promotion of good behavior. So here's an example where You know, we had a company we worked with, they lost all of their cherries out of Argentina because of a freeze. Well, they needed to buy 700,000 tons of cherries for cherry pie filling on the spot market. Their procurement folks just went and bought them, knowing that they had to hurry up and buy them because otherwise they would be lost and there'd be no supply left. Food safety never tested those cherries, didn't know where they were coming from. And so they had already procured that amount of product, but had no idea if it was safe, right? Had they done some analysis up front that there's a potential for freeze in Argentina, and we may at some point have to do some procurement on the spot market, they may have already built alternate sources that they may have looked at and done some pre-testing. You know, send us your quality inspection reports, assurances, certificates, COAs, you know, whatever those are. And so I think, you know, using data in this way really helps us to be proactive in a way that allows us to protect product that we're producing because we are smarter about sourcing.
I do notice that we've just got a few minutes left in our session, so I want to remind the audience that if you have any questions, you can jot those into the chat box. We'll move to your questions. In the meantime, we talked a little bit about the pandemic earlier. Let's return kind of here to our current state and look at some of the post-pandemic learnings that you think can help us better address things and be prepared for the future. Greg, do you want to start us out?
Sure. I think, you know, primarily some of what I've been hearing and reading about is really about creating a more nimble and agile supply chain. We've built a lot of efficiencies into the supply chains for very specific purpose of use. One example would be here, I'm here in Boise, Idaho. Earlier this year, the potato farmers had to dump, you know, half of their crop this year because that half was sold in through food service. And the supply chain was built specifically for food service, and those suppliers didn't have other outlets that they could move to. So they dumped tons of potatoes 50 miles from one of the wealthiest, you know, communities in America, Sun Valley, Ketchum, right there. And there you have a lot of food waste. So I think one of the things that is going to happen post-pandemic is being able to have more flexible and nimble supply chains, to know your alternatives and know where your risks are, so you could shift to those alternatives as you see issues and problems come up.
So Amy, I know that you work with the Department of Homeland Security and a number of other agencies. So you've been up to your elbows in the pandemic and response. What have you learned?
I think to Greg's point, that nimbleness, and I would say from not only a business process, but from a philanthropic process, you know, DHS has to source, or FEMA is trying to source and help feed hungry people. You know, how, and the government, you know, hasn't been great at this. How can the industry, or periphery to the industry, transporters, others, how can we flip? We had, I can't even speculate how much potato product was dumped, and we have hungry people all over this country, right? How do we more nimbly cut out the administrative red tape? I mean, could you do that in advance and think through that? In Wisconsin, I know there were some very resourceful companies that had liquid milk, and they just couldn't get it to market for various reasons, to include the packaging, right? A peripheral. And so some of the conversations in bed, could we create dry powder? Could we freeze? That became, you know, new challenges and thoughts about who has freezers large enough to hold this milk? How long is it shelf stable frozen? But those are all things I think now post-pandemic, we just need to be more resilient and adaptable in these situations. Keeping, you know, thinking about new ways for a product to be utilized, you know, is a great way to keep your employees working as well. I love the example, and I think it's Budweiser, when Budweiser, you know, starts canning water. I think that's great, and it's well thought out, and they know when to do it, and they keep their people employed, and they do a service. So I think post-pandemic, those are things we'll need to turn our attention to. They're just new outcomes we hadn't anticipated prior.
Right. So where do you see predictive AI, or AI and predictive analytics and machine learning going in the next 5 years, specifically as it pertains to the food supply? And will it make it safer, us safer? Amy, you go first.
I do really think that in the next 5 years, those companies that are willing to take the next step, we have some early adopters who've already flipped from reactive to proactive. And I think in the next 5 years, lots of others will take that leap. And what they'll realize there is that they have much more control of their product and their sourcing and delivering good product that is safe. They've mitigated counterfeiting, and they know when there are disruptions that will affect their bottom line or what they produce for their consumers. So I think in the next 5 years, we absolutely will see safer product for those that are willing to take that step and move to proactive.
Anyone else on the panel want to chime in?
I'll just chime in a little bit here. I think innovation is another area that, you know, applying machine learning and AI has a lot of potential in the future, and for companies to really take advantage there. And that's for anything of like what we were talking about with, you know, some of the mitigation that happened with either Budweiser or, you know, these milk companies in Wisconsin, is being able to understand, you know, when and how to shift, right? And shift into these new production methods or these new distribution channels that you have. So that's one innovative thing that you can do. But the other is actually is developing new product, right? Understanding trends from a consumer standpoint, understanding, you know, health trends that are out there, and can you find the right ingredients that are meeting the claims that you need to develop towards. You know, already we're starting to think about that with Market Hub is, you know, what types of information do we need to surface for our food producers and our developers and our manufacturers and brands to be able to find the right ingredients that are going to meet sustainability claims, that are going to meet local claims, right, of local food sources, that are going to meet clean label claims, things like that. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for AI and machine learning and algorithms to help get people to the right products and understand, you know, new and novel ingredients that they could use in the development of those products.
We have just gone a little bit over our allotted time, so I'm going to close out here with Amy giving us a little bit of advice. And I assume you have one or two pieces of golden advice that you just routinely come back to when you talk to people in the industry. So give us your little jewels of wisdom there, Amy.
Well, I think I'll give two. One is know your supply chain and your peripherals. So if you haven't mapped, do that. Map, monitor, and mitigate are sort of the three things I always say. Map and know where everything is. Monitor what's happening around those ingredients or what's happening in the world that'll affect your product, and then mitigate when you get an alert. And again, no action is action. And so being able to have enough information to make an informed decision is really important. I think the second piece of advice I would give is embrace technology, embrace data, embrace big data, and know what you have internally. What data does your company already produce? And how can you pair and use data from companies like TraceGain efficiently such that you can make those informed decisions? The big data science is here, and I think it's time to jump on the train if you haven't already.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you to Greg and Nate. This has been an interesting conversation. We really appreciate everyone's time. And I would like to just remind our audience, please go to the post-session survey and fill that out for us. Have a great rest of your TGCon.
Thanks, everyone.